Okay friends, it's time to get started on replacing our timing belt. This job overall is a fairly intensive job. We're going to have to take apart the entire passenger side of the engine. There's going to be multiple things we need to do up along the top inside the engine compartment, but there's also going to be things that we're going to have to access from underneath the vehicle itself. We're going to have it jacked up and the right front wheel removed to be able to do most of this job. Keep that in mind. With all that said, let's get started. The next thing we're going to do is come right over to the negative battery terminal. You have two wires on this that lead right to the strut tower right here. We're going to go ahead and remove the 15mm nut that holds the first wire on, pull it off, and then we'll go ahead and do the same exact thing to the second wire. Remove that wire, inspect both sides, set it aside. Remove that wire, inspect it as well, set both wires aside so they're making no contact with the body of the vehicle. Okay, so now we're going to want to safely raise and support the front of the vehicle just so the wheel's up off the ground. After that, remove all of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now, if you're doing this on a lift, it really only makes sense to go ahead and remove the passenger side wheel at the same time. That way there, when you bring this back down closer to the ground, you can bring it extra close so we can have more access from the top. Now with the wheel out of the way, let's go ahead and remove this plastic trim panel right here. You're going to find two 10mm headed bolts, one here and one right there. Aside from that, you should have a push clip located in this area. Go ahead and remove that, and then both of the bolts. Hold that shield. Remove it from the vehicle. Now we're just going to go ahead and turn this clockwise. That's going to release the tension, and we can grab the belt and start pulling it off of the AC compressor. Once it's off of there, carefully release tension, being very careful not to damage your sensor at all, and then we can remove the belt. Okay, so it's up and over the alternator up there. You can pull it down. Now at this point, you're going to want to inspect your serpentine belt. Make sure it's not torn or worn or damaged in any way. If it is, obviously, it's a great time to go ahead and replace it. This one looks fine, so I'll set it aside. Okay, so now that we have all that apart, let's continue on to this cross member right across here. Now there's going to be several bolts that we're going to have to remove, but before we start removing any of the lower bolts, let's remove the engine mount bolt right here using a 15mm. Now let's continue up here to our forward bolts. We'll use an 18mm to start removing the pair. One of these I'm going to leave in just a couple threads so we can move along to the rear bolts while it's still being held up. That was loud. All right, that one's nice and loose. Let's continue on back here. We're going to find 3 mounting bolts along this area, and you'll also have one right here. Let's use a 16mm to start removing them. Careful with this one. All right, now the next thing we need to do is go ahead and get a jack with a block of wood, and we're going to put it right underneath the oil pan right here, just essentially along this corner. We only want to add enough pressure to hold it still. There we are. Okay, now we can come over and start removing the alternator. First, let's start removing our electrical connectors. For this small one, there's going to be a red locking tab. Carefully grab onto that and pull it away. After that, press in on the center and remove the wiring. Now we're going to move along to the main wire for this. There's going to be 2 squeeze tabs. There's one here and one just under it. Squeeze the pair, pull this cover off. Under that, you're going to find a 13mm headed nut. Remove that and set this wire aside. 'Cause 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 Next, we're going to start removing the alternator from the bracket. You're going to find two 15mm headed bolts, one here and one located just behind it towards the firewall a little bit. Let's get these out of here. Remove that bolt. Let's grab that second one. Grab onto the alternator, give it a little wiggle, and remove it from the vehicle. Carefully pry under here. Inspect your alternator, set it aside. The next thing that I always like to do to give myself a little bit more space along this side of the engine is I'm going to go ahead and remove this. To do that, I'm going to squeeze this clamp, slide it out of the way, remove this hose. After that, you're going to find two 13mm headed bolts, one here and one located towards the rear section of this. Inspect that hose. Set that aside. Now we can carefully grab onto this. There's still going to be a hose attached to the bottom. We don't have to worry about this. We'll just carefully set this aside so it's not going to spill out anywhere. Now we're going to need to keep digging on this side of the engine. So let's go ahead and remove the idler pulley using a 13mm socket. Now let's go ahead and take out the mounting bolt that holds the power steering reservoir to the body. Come right here with our 13mm. Lift that up. I'm just going to put the bolt back in there for now. Now at this point we can move this around as needed so we can access the mounting bolts for this engine mount. Before we start messing with this though, let's use a floor jack. We're going to come right underneath the belly of the engine with a piece of wood, and we're going to carefully apply a little bit of pressure before we go ahead and remove this. Once you have the jack under there, let's continue back up top. We're going to go ahead and remove our two 10mm headed bolts. Now this one looks like somebody put a ground wire leading to it, but the ground wire generally is supposed to actually go to this area right there. So whichever place it came from, just make sure you reinstall it into the same area. Set that aside. Now we can continue up to these three mounting bolts. Okay, so now at this point, we're going to continue on to dismounting the power steering pump from its bracket. Looking inside this area right behind the pulley and the bracket, you can see that there's an inverted Torx right there. Essentially, an inverted Torx is going to look just like this right here. We're going to use a size 12. It's an E12. Now accessing that top bolt right there is going to be fairly easy overall, but there's going to be another mounting bolt that we have to be able to access, so we're going to carefully start jacking up the engine, being careful and paying attention for any funny noises. You don't want to start crushing anything along the way. Let's get this one loose. Now that we have that bolt loose, let's continue on to the other two. You're going to find one that's located down inside this area here, and then the other one that's going to be a little bit harder to get to is basically directly underneath this area, right down inside this area. Now I'm going to use a magnet to try to pull it out of there. Let's grab our magnet. Remove that bolt as well. Now we can continue on to this top bolt, which of course is going to be much easier. Once that one comes out, there isn't going to be anything holding the power steering pump to this bracket. So once that's out, we'll just go ahead and swing it a little bit so it's out of our way. Now we can move along to removing the Serpentine Belt tensioner. This tensioner has a bolt that comes straight through it. You can see it right here, and it goes directly into the engine. As you can tell, there isn't very much room in this area to be able to get to this bolt or even remove it. So what we're going to have to do is start lowering down the engine so we can access this bolt through the wheel well. Now we're just going to go ahead and pull this panel aside a little bit, and we can use our 16mm to get right on this center bolt and loosen it up. Fully remove this bolt and remove the tensioner. Now I'm just going to hold on to that tensioner. I'm going to break it free from the engine. Set it aside. Next, we're going to move along to removing the crank pulley. Let's do that by using an 18mm on the center bolt here. Inspect that bolt, set it aside. Now the next tool that we're going to have to use is a harmonic balancer pulley tool. You can see it has 3 ears on it. It also has the adapters that we're going to need. All right, so now let's go ahead and take the pulley unit here. What I want to do is I want to take each of these ears and I'm going to slide it right behind the backing of this area, right along here. Sometimes you just have to wiggle it around a little bit to be able to get them behind there. Now once they're behind, you can grab the rest of the tool. We'll start with the shaft. We're going to use the longer adapter shaft. They come in usually 3 different sizes. It really depends on your kit. We'll stick that right through there. Now we can go ahead and put this on. And when we do this, we want that shaft that we just put in to go inside this area here as well. So you just want to line up all that. Now the next thing we're going to want to do is hold this centerpiece with a 1-inch wrench. After that, I'm going to use a 22mm socket to go ahead and turn this in by hand with my ratchet. As we're doing this, what we're aiming for is this pulley right here should start pulling away from the engine. Pulling away quite a bit at this point, so you're going to want to make sure you hold on to that pulley just so it doesn't fall down and potentially get damaged. All right, feels like it's pretty much ready to come off. Go ahead and remove that pulley, inspect it, and then set it aside. Now at this point, we're just going to put a little bit of support underneath the engine. You can either use the jack you're already using or whatever you need to do. Basically, we just want to take some of the pressure off of those existing motor mounts that are still holding things in place. Okay, so now at this point, we can start removing our timing belt cover. That's this black unit right here. You're going to notice that you have several mounting points for this. There's going to be a whole bunch of 10mm. There's also going to be some Torx bits that you're going to need to use. Let's start off by removing some of our 10mm that we can reach, and then we'll continue on with the rest of our hardware. Let's continue with the 10mm. For these up here, I'm just going to use a ratcheting wrench. All right, now at this point, we've removed all the 10mm headed bolts that we can reach from down along the bottom. I'm going to continue back up along the top. We're going to jack up the engine a little bit, finish removing the top hardware, get back under here, and then finish removing this lower hardware. Okay, now for up top, we can start removing these 2 10s from the back. Let's go ahead and get this out of the area. Set this aside. Now from back inside the wheel well, let's continue on by removing this 15mm nut. So now we're going to continue over to these two Torx bolts right here. I'm going to start with the top one, and that's a T30 Torx bit. Now we can move along to removing this Torx bolt as well. This one's a little bit larger. You're going to use a T40 Torx bit for this. Keep in mind, when you remove this bolt, it is the last bolt holding this plate in, so just be very careful so it doesn't fall down and potentially hurt you. Go ahead and carefully grab onto that shield. We're going to give this a little wiggle, slide it off of the stud, and bring it down and out of the vehicle. Now to work on this timing belt right here, you can either try to remove it from on top of the engine. Of course, you'd want to just jack it up a little bit so you can access everything, or you can come right through the wheel well as I am. Right, so now at this point, we have a nice clear view of our timing belt inside this area. We're going to have to start removing that. So to do that, we're going to take our bolt that's supposed to be for the crank. Go ahead and put that right back in there and snug it up. Okay, so now what we need to do is make sure that we have everything inside the engine aligned. What I mean by that is you have your crank right along here. You're going to want to make sure that this is lined up with the TDC right here. Right up where the yellow crayon is, you can see that it has a triangle underneath it. If you were to look at this pulley right here along the backside, you're also going to see a small triangle that should come into place, and it should line up perfectly with that triangle on the engine. I'm going to use my 18mm. I'm going to turn this slowly until the two triangles look like they line up. That looks like it's pretty close right there. You want to get this as close as possible. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and follow that timing belt all the way up to where your cam gears are. Now we're going to be looking for timing marks on that as well. For this one in particular, I can see right here where you can see a little bit of yellow. That's one of the timing marks. You're going to have the exact same thing on the rearward one. What you want to pay attention to is this mark right here needs to actually line up with the carve out on the housing of the engine right up there. So that tells me that I need to continue turning this engine over until those cams line up, and then of course this lines up as well. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to start turning this clockwise so we can start lining up all three of those top dead center markings. Let's do this nice and slow. We don't need to damage anything. It's not a race. All right, I'm coming up to where my triangle is for this crank here. Let's get that lined up with the triangle. Take a peek up there at those cam gears. Make sure they look like they're lined up as well. Double check all three areas. This is super important. You need to be sure. We're going to move along to removing the tensioner that holds the timing belt in place. When we do this, we're just going to go back and forth between these bolts, making sure that we're not putting too much pressure on either of them as we're removing this. You can see the tensioner moving as we're doing this. Next, we're going to have to turn the axle a little bit. Try to get this bolt out of here. Now we can carefully grab onto this. You might notice that it wants to hit up against the axle. If that's the case, we're just going to come right inside here, the pry bar. We'll gently turn this until the slot on the axle lines up so we can access this. Pull that tensioner out of there. Now we can carefully grab onto our timing belt here. We'll just gently pull this off. We're being very careful not to spin any of the cams, whether it's the forward one or the rearward one.
I got it.
Good. There's our timing belt. So now it's going to be time to go ahead and get the timing belt up in here. I'm just going to take it, put it up and over this top one, all the way in the far rear. Bring it down and around the water pump. Put it up and over this one. And then we'll just bring it down this way to the crank. Now once you have it around the crank down here, I'm just going to use something to wedge in between. One of these markers works perfect. It's essentially just to hold the belt so it can't skip a tooth. Okay, so now that I have the belt up and over the cam right here, what we're going to want to do is take an 18mm wrench. We're going to come right onto the bolt that's on this camshaft. I'm going to lift up on the belt a little bit to release it from the cam itself. I'm going to carefully start turning this clockwise just a tiny bit so I can grab onto the next groove of the belt. Get that on there. Hold that tight. Once you have it on, go ahead and turn that counterclockwise again. Make sure that your grooves are lined up, still on those timing marks there. This looks pretty good. I'm going to hold tension on this just to make sure it doesn't release, and then just double check it right here. You want it to pretty much be just like this. Bong, bong. That feels good. Now I'm just going to go ahead and put something inside here to hold this belt so it doesn't release on me again. Let's see if I can get this in right here. Okay, I've got that one up in there locked in. Now we can bring this down and underneath the water pump. And then we're going to do the exact same thing for the rearward cam. Just pretty much put it right up and over in position. This is going to need to be completely taut here. So once again, grab onto that 18mm bolt up there. Carefully turn it clockwise just a tiny bit until it locks into the very next tooth. Turn it counterclockwise, lock it in, make sure everything's nice and taut. So I'm going to tug on that belt a little bit. I'm going to have to turn this clockwise. Very careful here. Okay, I'm going to release that. Take a peek, make sure the timing marks are still lined up. Let's go ahead and set that in with something just so it doesn't release on us again. That just makes it so the belt can't skip a tooth. And now we're just going to double check just to make sure you're completely taut on the belt. See? Not too much movement there, not very much movement here, and we're still nice and tight in this area. The only loose area is where the tension's supposed to be. Now it's time to put the tensioner in here. We're going to line up our pin with the hole that's in here. Let's get it right on there. Slide it up and into position. Now we can start in both of our mounting bolts. You don't need to use any red thread locker on these. Just take them just as they are, put them right up and in. As we start tightening these, essentially I just want to bottom the bolt out so it hits up against the tensioner. I'll do the exact same thing to this one, and then we'll bring them both up, back and forth, until it's completely sitting up against the engine. The next thing we're going to do is torque each of these bolts to 250 inch-pounds. Inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. Okay, so now the next thing that we're going to want to do before we go ahead and pull that pin is just inspect everything. You want to pay attention to all those top dead center marks. We have the hatches right up along the top of the crank. We want to make sure that's good, but then also up along those cams up there. We have the marking. You want to make sure the marking on the cam is lined up with the notch on the engine. I've said it a bunch of times at this point, but I'm going to reiterate it because once you get this back together, you don't want to be off by even one tooth. All right, so now once you've confirmed everything, let's go ahead and get all this stuff out of the way. Pretty much everything that was holding the belt in position for us, we can get it right out of there. Now at this point, it's time to pull the pin on our tensioner. When we do this, this might push up a tiny bit, but it shouldn't go very far. There we are. Double check everything, make sure it still feels nice and tight and taut everywhere it needs to be. If you want to quadruple check those timing marks again, it really couldn't hurt. So we double checked everything, it's looking perfect. Now we can't stop there. The next thing that we're going to want to do is go ahead and turn over the engine by turning this crank right here clockwise, never counterclockwise. While we turn it clockwise, we're going to be trying to pay attention to the top dead center marking that we have right up along here. The second time that it comes around is when the cam should also be at top dead center. So essentially every time we turn this twice, we're going to look up there and make sure that all the timing marks line up. We're going to have to do this several times because we want to make sure that it's perfect before we put it all back together. Okay, so there's my top dead center mark there. So that's halfway around. Let's go ahead and turn this. All right, so now that I made my turn around, I can see that my top dead center line is lined up for the crank. I'm looking up along the front, and that mark looks like it's perfect as well. So this is looking pretty good. Let's continue on to the back here. Also just as important, I'm looking at it, and it looks like it might be off by one tooth back there. Yeah. So we can't leave it like this. You can't leave it off by one tooth or even half a tooth, really, to be honest with you. So what we're going to have to do is I'm going to put my markers back inside here, holding the timing belt along this area down here, up along the top cam, because we know both of these areas are still good. And then we're going to come back down here, re-loosen these bolts. As they start coming down, we can start adjusting the tension up there so we can end up dealing with the cam. All right. So now at this point, I've got this torqued again, so we can go ahead and pull the pin. Let's go ahead and get these out of there. And now let's turn the engine over a couple more times and triple check our timing belt. Make sure that that's perfectly lined up right there. Now we're going to check those cams, make sure those markings are lined up. Forward one is perfect, and the rearward one is perfect as well. So we're not going to stop there. Obviously, when the engine's running, it's going to be spinning a whole bunch of times, so we don't want to risk it. Let's just go ahead and bring this around. We're going to recheck this another 2, maybe even 3 times, just to confirm that everything's perfect before we go ahead and put it all back together. All right, so we cranked it over a bunch of times. I checked it several times. This last time, we're going to go ahead and double check. We've got our top dead center right here with the little arrow that's on the crank. Let's look up along there. We're going to check the forward cam. That one is lined up absolutely perfectly. The rearward cam here, this one's a little harder to see, especially from the angle. You want to make sure you get it as close as possible. It's common for the rearward one to be off by one tooth. That's why I had to reset it originally. But this looks perfect at this point. I'm just going to double check to make sure the belt's nice and taut. That feels perfect. Let's continue. Now we can go ahead and get our shield up in here. Just carefully slide it up and into position. Now let's just go ahead and get our bolt holes lined up. The next thing we're going to do is start putting in all of our mounting bolts. When we do this, we're only going to start each of them in. Once everything's started, we can snug them up. I'm going to start with my torque screws here, and we're going to go ahead and put these in. I'm going to use the larger one down inside this hole right here, just above the OP switch or oil pressure sensor. Now I'll use the smaller one inside the next hole up. Use some of these 10mm headed bolts down along here. Go ahead and grab that mounting nut. We'll start that on there. And now let's get up top and start in the rest of our mounting bolts and of course put in that upper plate. Now we can get this shield in there. Once it's lined up, we'll just start in some of our 10mm headed bolts up along the top here. Now underneath this mount area here is where those 13mm headed bolts is going to go. Now our last two 10mm headed bolts. Okay. Now at this point, I have all of my mounting bolts started. Let's go ahead and snug them up. From under here, let's start with our 10mm bolts. Now it's time to put on our harmonic balancer. For this, you want to, of course, have this area right inside here, clean and free of any debris. Also, make sure you just clean up the shaft along here. After that, go ahead and push it up into position. The next thing that you're going to want to have is a nice rubber mallet here. We're just going to give this a couple loving bonks. We don't have to knock it in too hard to damage the engine, but just enough to get it seated so we can get our bolt in there a couple good threads and then drive it in the rest of the way. Go ahead and take your bolt, make sure it's clean and free of any debris. You do not need to use any thread locker on this. Now we're going to continue tightening this bolt until this is bottomed out. So now we're going to go ahead and torque this bolt to 70 foot-pounds. But what you're going to notice as you start to turn this, it's going to turn the engine over. To prevent that from happening, I'm just going to use a screwdriver. I'm going to carefully come in between one of these ears right here and the lower bolt that holds the cover on to the engine. After that, I can use my torque wrench. We'll crank it up to 70 foot-pounds and torque it down. Now the next thing we want to do while the engine's still sitting down lower is just use a nice wire brush, and we're going to go right along the engine where our serpentine belt tensioner is supposed to be. You essentially just want to go ahead and get off any corrosion that might be in this area. Now that I've got the large chunks off of the engine itself, let's also look at the back side of the tensioner. You can see that I have a lot of raised areas. Go ahead and do the same to this. You want to pay special attention to this nub right here. That's pretty much the locating nub. It goes into the engine a little bit. You want to make sure it's free and clear of corrosion. Now we can go ahead and start putting the tensioner in. Pay attention to the bolt hole that's in the engine and also the area for the nub on the tensioner. If you want to use a little bit of copper never sees in that nub hole, that's completely up to you, but I wouldn't put any in the bolt hole itself. Now you can see the angle that this tensioner has to be at. It's pretty much aiming down towards where the OP switch is. Now once you have this bottomed out and your shirt's flushed up against the engine, go ahead and torque it to 30 foot-pounds. Now the next thing we're going to do is start bringing up the engine a little bit so we can start putting in that forward cross member. Now we can take our 2 forward bolts with the rubber bushings. We'll slide them right up into position. We'll start these in. Make our way to the rear, start in those bolts as well. Now in the rear, you're going to notice that you have 3 longer bolts and you have 1 shorter bolt. The shorter bolt of the 4 is going to go in the far rear. Let's snug them up. Now the next thing we're going to do is line up the bolt hole for our mount up front. After that, go ahead and take that big old bolt, slide it on through and start it in. Now let's torque all these bolts right here to 41 foot-pounds. And now we'll torque this engine mount bolt to 44 foot-pounds. Okay, so now that we're back inside the engine compartment, the next thing that we're going to want to do is mount our power steering pump. 2 of the bolts are going to be fairly easy to get to with the engine down like it is. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and raise it up as high as I can without putting too much pressure on anything and damaging anything. And then we're going to go ahead and put in all 3 of our mounting bolts, snug them up, and torque them. Now we've got our 3 mounting bolts for this. Just going to try to get this into position. I'm going to line up the hole on the side of the pulley here so I can start putting this through. Hard part's just getting the first one lined up. After that, you just pivot it around. Everything else should line up pretty good. Now I'm going to use my E12 socket. I'm just going to start this in. We're not going to bottom it out or anything. We're going to, of course, start in all 3 of our mounting bolts, and then we'll snug them up. Okay, that one's gone in quite a bit at this point. Get it a little closer, but we still want to have plenty of room to be able to move the pump around. There we are. Start in the other 2. Okay, now I'm just going to shake this around a little bit until it feels like it lines up in position. Start in that bolt. Now I'm going to get my torque wrench in here. We're going to torque each of these 3 bolts to 22 foot-pounds. Remove your support. Okay, now it's time to put on our engine bracket over here. That's going to go right along the passenger side. Carefully slide it into position. Just put that there. Now I'm going to go ahead and slide my jack back underneath the engine, bring it up so this is level, and all of my bolt holes line up. Now we're going to start in all 5 of our mounting bolts before we tighten any of them up. The bolts that you're going to want to use for these right here are going to be these darker bolts. And if you were to look at the top of them, you're going to see a 10.9. It's important to use the right bolts. Now that we have them all bottomed out, let's go ahead and torque these larger bolts to 33 foot-pounds. Now that we've torqued our larger bolts, let's torque these smaller bolts to 20 foot-pounds. Now it's time to put on our idler pulley. We're just going to go ahead and put it right over this shaft here. Grab your mounting bolt, slide that through. After that, you're going to bottom this out and then torque this to 25 foot-pounds. Now that we have this completely torqued in, let's go ahead and remove the jack from under the engine. Now before we can go ahead and put our alternator back inside the car, you're going to want to pay quick attention to a bushing that it has located on it. Now to mount this alternator onto the bracket, you're going to have a bolt that comes through from the forward side of it, and then it comes right through to this bushing and it screws directly into it. When that bolt tightens up, it's going to slide this bushing inward and it's going to press it directly up against the mounting inside the vehicle. So what we need to do is just take a hammer and a punch. We're going to carefully get in between this area and just try driving it down a tiny bit. What you're going to see is this area right here just come down. We don't need to push it all the way out, just enough so there's enough room for the bracket. Now we can slide this right over the bracket. We've got our bushing area here. We're going to bring it right down over this. Slides over easy peasy. We can start our longer bolt in and through. Screw that right in a couple threads. Let's take the rearward bolt, slide this through, get it into the bracket as well. Bottom out both of your bolts. Now we're going to torque each of these bolts to 31 foot-pounds. That's the sound of the bushing pressing in. Now we can put on our power steering reservoir. Take a look at the bottom. You're going to see that you have a little tab that comes down. That's going to need to fit in down near this area here. Let's go ahead and get this in position. Start our bolt through. Snug it up. Make sure it's nice and tight. Now we can get the coolant reservoir in here. We're going to slide it into position so we see our mounting bolts line up. Start that one in there. We've got this other one. Start that in back here. Snug them up. Let's put on this upper coolant hose. Slide it in till it touches up against the reservoir. Grab the clamp, slide it into its original position. Make sure it's secure. Now we can start hooking up the wires to our alternator. You want to make sure that the terminal end on this wire is nice and clean and free of any corrosion or debris. We'll slide it right on there. Take your 13mm nut. We'll bottom this out, and then you're going to torque this to 88 inch-pounds. You want to make sure you put on your protective cover. Make sure that's completely locked in so it can't fall off. We'll continue on to this wire. Slide it in, listen for a click. Give it a little tug, make sure it's secure, lock it in. Now we can start putting on our serpentine belt. We're only going to start putting it on up along the top here. We'll hang it down a little lower, get back inside the wheel well so we can finish off putting it on. Let's start sliding the serpentine belt in here. Just going to put it down and past the power steering pump here. That's this. Press it down past the idler, down past the tensioner down there as well. Now the next thing we're going to do is take this belt. We're going to loop it up and around the alternator here, bring it down and around the idler, And then we'll just push this all down so that we can reach it from the bottom. Now I have this slid down into place. The way I have it is right over the alternator here, and then I'm going to bring the forward aspect of the belt down and underneath this idler pulley, bring it around it, and then up and over the power steering pump. At this point, the rest of the belt is going to be located down at the bottom, which is where we're going to need to be. Let's get inside that wheel well. Okay, so from now inside the wheel well, we can see exactly how we have the belt situated. The forward aspect of it is going to come straight down along the front and then make its way underneath the AC compressor right here. If you were to look at where the rearward part of the belt came straight down, I brought it down along the front of the tensioner pulley and then right underneath it and then up and over the crank. At this point, it's sitting here waiting for me, so I'm just going to go ahead and pull this, turn it clockwise. That's going to relieve the tension, and then I'll slide it over the crank and into position. Let's regroup. Okay, so now that we have the belt onto all the pulleys, you just need to double check it real quick. What we're paying attention to is the ribbed areas on all of the pulleys. You want to make sure that the ribbed areas on the belt are fitting directly inside of them. If it seems like the belt is sitting off to one side or the other of any of the pulleys, you need to make sure that you go ahead and grab on that tensioner, relieve some tension, and then fully adjust it. Double check to make sure it's secure on all the pulleys properly. Now we can get our splash shield in here. When we put this up, we're going to put it up and behind the body right here so you can see our little tabs where the screws are going to go into. We'll just line those up with their corresponding holes in the body. Grab both of our mounting bolts, start them in. Once they're both started, snug them up. Now let's get in here. We're going to get all three of these pieces lined up. Grab our push clip. I'm going to reach from the back side. Try to hold all these in position. Slide that push clip through. Lock it in. All right, now at this point, we're going to go ahead and get the wheel back up on here. We'll start on all 5 of our lug nuts, snug them up, get the wheel back on the ground, and then torque it to 100 foot-pounds. With the wheel back on the ground, let's torque each of these lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. Now if you remove the other side wheel, make sure you put that on and torque it as well. Okay, we're cruising along. The next thing that we're going to do is reconnect our negative battery terminal to the body. Let's take our single wire, make sure that the terminal end is free and clear of any corrosion or debris that might be on either side. Slide it right up against there. Now we're going to take our mounting nuts. I'm going to take the smaller of the 2 nuts. We'll start this on here, bottom it out. Make sure that's nice and tight. Now we can take our other battery wire, put that right on there. We'll use the larger of the 2 nuts. Tighten this one up as well. Double check, make sure they're both secure. All right, let's go ahead and try to start up this engine. Oh yeah, listen to that baby purr. Okay, so now that we just ran it for a few seconds, we went ahead and we turned it right back off because we want to get back out here and we want to double check our serpentine belt. Once again, we're making sure that it's still on all the pulleys the way that it needs to be.